Welcome back, everyone. So for this session, we're looking at surrealism, which is probably the most important movement of the early 20th century in Europe, and the United States, actually, for its influence, if you're counting longevity and influence. So it's an important movement to look at, and it's also rather large. So we look at two different moments in surrealism. So the very beginnings of it in 1924, and then at the second half of class, we go to 1929, where there's a bit of an offshoot, a dissident group of surrealists that surround themselves with around Georges Bataille. So we'll talk about that group in the second half, and they're a little different. So with surrealism, we have to go back to good old Dr. Freud, who we've talked about at the very beginnings of this semester. But whereas in the context of primitivist painting like Kirchner and Picasso and Matisse, and even the Vienna secessionists like Klimt, Schiele, and Kokoschka, they weren't really reading Freud directly. Freud, these ideas were kind of in the air in the early 20th century. So they weren't really reading him directly, but there's a way in which art historians can go back and say, oh, maybe the artists are doing certain things in paint in the same way that Freud was doing it in writing and in thinking and in clinical work. That's different today. Revisiting Freud's ideas with surrealism, we're going to be dealing with artists who really are studying him, really are reading him, and rather directly influenced by his ideas. Now, they're going to use his ideas in a different way, and in a way that actually he didn't appreciate. Like, he would not have liked this very experimental, artistic, creative uses of his concepts or his discoveries. But nonetheless, we're going to be talking quite a bit about Freud with surrealism. There's no getting around it, and it's actually quite a lot of fun, even if sometimes the theories feel like a bit of a stretch at times. There are redeeming qualities to Freud. So, Surrealism 1, let's just jump straight into it. It starts in 1924, and it comes straight out of Dada. So Dada actually ends in 1924, and almost overnight, a number of Dada artists, they basically found Surrealism. And the most important is André Breton. At least he's kind of the impresario. He's the head honcho of the Surrealists in Paris. And he starts to gather this group around him, and they start devising this new movement out of Dada called Surrealism. The first thing to note is that there are similarities between Dada and Surrealism, right? Surrealism is indebted to Dada. Both movements are going to be pretty radically political, and very much on the left. Surrealism will even align itself with the Communist Party. At some point, they're even going to try to collaborate with the Communist Party. In 1931, they put up an anti-colonialist exhibition with the help of the Communist Party. But the Communist Party didn't really want this to be well known because they didn't quite trust the Surrealists, these crazy artists going around doing all sorts of nutty things. At least in their eyes. They're much more politicians, right? So it was an uneasy marriage between the Communist Party in the 20s and 30s and the Surrealists. But I just want to stress the point that they are definitely political. But whereas Dada was like full-on instigators, and using like the public sphere, remember photographs, exhibitions that went right in the face of the public. The Surrealists will do this a bit too, but the political terrain shifts a bit in Surrealism, where it's now less about the public sphere as a space of combat, and more about the human mind itself. And then this is where Freud and psychoanalysis come in, because they're going to be using his terms and his concepts as a way to use the human mind, especially the unconscious, which is really important for the Surrealists and for Freud, obviously, as a way to lead to a revolutionary future. So this is different. With Dada, it was much more at the surface level of society. Here, the idea for surrealism is much more revolutionary, of that begins in the human unconscious. So there is a distinction. And the surrealists are going to be much more into art, as traditionally understood. Dada, I mean, they really didn't care about art. They were kind of anti-art, anti-aesthetic. They used the visual means necessary to achieve their political and transgressive ends. The surrealists are going to do this too, but they're going to be more committed to drawing and to painting, and fine art as traditionally understood. So that's a difference. And that's also indebted to Breton, who was much more of like an aesthete, right? So like a connoisseur of art. So it begins, as so many avant-garde movements do, with a manifesto and a journal. So this is the first révolution surréaliste, the surrealist revolution, where in your textbook, actually, they talk about this. Initially, the surrealists, especially headed by Pierre Naval, they're not into painting yet. There's not even an understanding that painting could even be surrealist or drawing. They're into photographs. They're into the reality of the street. A lot of the photographs in this journal are in fact just like anonymous, photographs from the public. And they're also into, as you can imagine, since they're into Freud, they're into analyzing dreams, which we'll talk about a bit in a moment. So you'll have recollections of dreams in the journal that you can read, and then also like other testimonials, other writings like about hypnosis sessions. So these guys used to kind of try to hypnotize each other to sort of bring out the unconscious, probably in very irresponsible ways, because at some point this guy, Robert Denos, he grabs a knife and starts chasing people. So then they kind of put an end to the hypnosis sessions. So I think you kind of get my drift, that they're using like these kind of clinical techniques of talking of dream analysis and of hypnosis, but they're doing it for very like creative and more transgressive ends. And here's another cover. This is another journal or book, actually, by Breton. He's the head of the surrealists. What is surrealism? And I think you can tell just from the cover. This is by Magritte, a Belgian painter who we'll end on in the first half of class. And I think you can tell one of the things they were really preoccupied with, if not obsessed with, is sexuality, is sex. And this too would be something that Freud would be interested in. The development of human sexuality is a really important question for Freud, as far as understanding like how to be, for Freud anyway, is like a healthy, normal human being, right? It runs through in many instances like a proper sexualization of the child into adulthood. So you can see why Freud would have been controversial in the early part of the 20th century. The surrealists are also interested in sexuality, but again, in a much more creative and maybe even transgressive way, and in a way that usually will leave the female form unquestioned and maybe even slightly debased, and sometimes actually not slightly debased. Like sometimes the female body is a zone of violence for the surrealists. So that's an open question that we leave aside for now, but can surrealism, what did surrealism think about women who appear so often in the work, as you'll see today, and you see in this drawing by Magritte, which we could have a field day psychoanalyzing, but we don't have time, so let's move forward. So along with the journals, the manifesto that Breton writes in 1924 is also important. And he writes a really well-known definition for surrealism. So it's a much longer manifesto than this. This is simply the sort of dictionary definition that he provides. But it tells us a lot about how he understood surrealism to function and what it was. So for him, surrealism, he calls it psychic automism in its pure state. Psychic automism, think of it as the mind without conscious control, like automatic. It's like your mind on autopilot. So it's not you willing your thoughts. It's this deeper part of you, what Freud would have called either the preconscious or the unconscious. So the surrealists are interested in psychic automism, the part of us that we don't have control over. And this is the fundamental revolution of Freud's thinking, the idea that the human, like people, human subjects are born and are inherently riven. They're split between their conscious mind and then all this unconscious, murky, inaccessible material beneath the surface of the conscious mind. So the surrealists are interested in tapping into that. And this is what surrealism tries to do through psychic automatism. And the psychic automatism shouldn't be dictated, is a form of thinking, but it's, again, in the absence of any control exercised by reason. So these are like the irrational forces, the irrational desires and drives of the human mind. And they should be exempt from any aesthetic concerns, which means the surrealists don't care about whether or not something is beautiful or ugly. That's not the criteria, nor moral concerns. And this is especially important for the surrealists. So if the idea that comes out, that bubbles forth from this psychic automatic process, if it's an idea that you can't even deal with, like you can't believe you have this thought or you have this drive or this desire inside you, then all the better for the surrealists, right? Because then it'll be in some ways transgressive, and it'll get to like the core essence of the surreal existence part of us, not the gloomy real, but the surreal. So for the surrealists, using psychic automism, tapping into the unconscious, all of this was in the service of making the world more interesting and enchanted again. So they have a conception of the 1920s Paris, and the future that they see is one of utter banality, where everything is boring, everything is the same, everybody's just interested in living their little bourgeois lives and having their jobs and making their money and having a scientific outlook on life and so on and so forth, right? All those things that they would have thought that this is just a tragic, impoverished version of living. They wanted to live in a much more ecstatic sort of way, one where every day there's something new and interesting and enchanting. And so for them to attain this, they go after the surreal. They go after the psychic material in us that's more difficult and charged to handle. So that's all fine and good. That's sort of the conceptual overview of it. But then how do you attain this? How do you get to this psychic automism? How in the world can you even think without reason? Right, this almost seems paradoxical. In some strange way, it's almost like Buddhist, right? The idea of quieting the mind and letting go. So how do you attain this? How would a group of artists and writers attain this? One way would be through automatic writing. So this is a manuscript of The Magnetic Fields, which was written by Breton and another poet, Soupeau. And they wrote this by total chance methods. So what they did was they would write, but they tried not to think about what they're writing. This is called, this is an approximation of free association, or you're just brainstorming, where you're trying not to think about what you're going to say. You just like let the pen go. You just like let your mind just wander. And then, of course, you see what comes out, right? What sort of interesting, crazy thoughts come out of you. And then what do they say? What are they symptomatic of? Right, something deeper in you that says something about you that's more profound than simply your everyday conscious mind. That was exactly what the surrealists were after. So through automatic writing, you're gonna be able to sort of try to open the floodgates of the unconscious mind by writing in such a way that's not willed. Right. The other way, and this is where they get even closer to Freud, would be through dreams. So if there's a work that's of utmost importance to the surrealists, it would be the interpretation of dreams that Freud publishes in 1899, 1900. we need a very quick 101 of Freud's theory of dreams to move forward, to really understand how the surrealists used it. So I'm going to give it to you very quickly. For Freud, you don't have access to your unconscious. It's not like a toolbox that you can open and go in and say, oh wow, I have this tool, and then analyze it, right, and understand something about yourself. The unconscious is something for Freud that's necessarily murky and elusive, right? And it's most often this material inside you that accrues over time, beginning with when you're a child. And for Freud, he wouldn't have had any understanding of genetics, but he did have a conception of like primordial desires of the human species. We'll talk about this with the uncanny, that can also inform and be part of the unconscious, right? Well, whatever the case may be, we all have this reservoir of the unconscious, but we don't have access to it. And there's a reason for that, because the stuff in the unconscious is repressed material that we can't handle. Just think of like a theory of trauma in Freud, or even more contemporary theories of trauma. Usually a trauma, the basic definition is you experience something that you weren't ready for, that was so horrible, so violent, so out of the ordinary, that it completely saturates your ability to understand it, and then you disavow it, you repress it, and it just goes way deep, right? And then it stays there. So you don't have access to it in your waking life. But this is maybe kind of the cruel thing of the conception of Freud's theories. It certainly affects you. Your unconscious material definitely affects you, right? In all sorts of different ways. Which is why, for Freud and for psychoanalysis more generally, it's important to fish in there a little bit to see what happened and what's going on, and how you can, in some ways, come to terms with this unconscious material. So while you don't have direct access to it, to your unconscious, for Freud, there are moments in life where it comes out. It will kind of naturally come out. And one of these examples would be in everyday speech, when you have a slip of the tongue or you say something by chance or accidentally. Freud will argue that it's your unconscious speaking through these mistakes or these slips of the tongue that you've made. So that's a small example of the unconscious coming through. But for Freud, the most privileged way that the unconscious material comes out is when you're asleep and when you're dreaming. So when you're asleep, you don't have your guard up. Your conscious mind is on sleep mode, and then all this unconscious stuff can start having a field day and come out to play. It's important to realize, though, that in the dream doesn't just like communicate to you something like in a very direct way. It will only communicate to you in very oblique, metaphoric ways, in like allegorical ways. So usually, this is Freud's theory of dreams. The dream images that you have, the dream work that you have, the dreams that you have are not literal. So if you dream about a forest, you're not really dreaming about trees. A classic example is usually when people have dreams of their teeth falling out. This is evidently a common dream. It's not that you have a fear of the dentist or your teeth falling out. The interpretation is that you have a fear of abandonment, like you're afraid that you're going to be abandoned. So you have deep abandonment issues. That's the theory, anyways. And so this gets to the very point of dreams for Freud. Dreams are things that you have inside you that you can't admit to. Like it's too much, so you can't quite admit to it. And often for Freud, these are wishes. Fundamentally for Freud, dreams were wish fulfillments. That a dream is trying to satisfy a wish that you can't in your waking life admit to having, right? So that's the theory of dreams for Freud. And the surrealists will, above all, be influenced by this, because you're going to see in their paintings, and you're going to see in their visual practices of other kinds, that it's often very dreamy, it's often very dreamlike, and they're using their own dreams in order to paint, and then the paintings then become almost symptomatic of their minds, right? So let's move forward and look at some examples. Here's André Masson. So he would be one of the original surrealists who was with Breton in 1924, and he actually doesn't start out as an artist, but he is a soldier in World War I, and the war has a big influence on everybody, on Freud, on Breton. They're both working in hospitals as orderlies, and on Masson, who evidently saw some horrible things and probably had what was then called shell shock, but then today we call a post-traumatic stress disorder. And so he started making art as a way of almost understanding and self-therapy. So here's a really nice example. It's called Furious Sons, and this is an automatic drawing. So we talked about automatic writing, where you would go down, where you'd have a white page, and then you just write whatever comes to your mind without trying to think about it. Well, that's what Masson did. He had a piece of drawing paper, and he started to draw without thinking about what he's drawing, at least trying not to think about what he's drawing. Then afterwards, he would go back in and try to find meaning. He would try to find figures and shapes and that sort of thing. And oftentimes he would find fish. Fish are a recurring theme and motif in his work. So here's a fish down here. You might even see others, right? This becomes like almost a Rorschach test. You know those tests where, the ink block tests, where you see a shape and then you're supposed to say the first thing that comes to your mind. And then supposedly whatever you came to you says something about you, right? So he goes back into his drawing and performs this type of self-analysis where he sees these fish, he sees these other shapes, like maybe lots of eyes and that sort of thing. And then it becomes like a dream work. It becomes some sort of image-scape that he then tries to understand. And again, with Freud, the fish is not a fish, or usually it's not a fish. Although Freud very famously said that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar in another context. But for the most part, in dreams, like a fish is not a fish, right? The fish will represent something else. And usually it's like through a metaphor or something called a metaphor, which is a type of displacement, or something called a metonym, which is a type of condensation. These are the terms that Freud uses in the dream work text. And that just simply means that, the fish will stand in for something else. So it might stand in for the ocean as a metonym, like it's a part of the ocean, and the ocean is the thing that's really meaningful for Masson. Somehow the ocean is something that's traumatic. Or maybe more compellingly, that's like think of this as like just a fish out of water, like a dead fish, and that's getting back. That's more a metaphor for like the trenches and the war and all the death that he saw. He can't see it directly again. So it can only that trauma only comes back out through a more veiled metaphoric form, like a dead fish, right? So that, anyways, is the theory of Freud and the dream work. So you'll have drawings like this that are types of automatic drawings that the theory goes will sort of open and give you access to the unconscious mind of the artist. Then you have painters that do similar things. So this is Juan Miro, who's originally Spanish, and he's one of the more acclaimed painters of the surrealist movement. He does these really beautiful paintings. If you see them in person, you'll appreciate them even more. I'm a big fan, especially when I work and when I write, of listening to ambient music or electronic, more ambient music, which you get the sense of being sort of enveloped in this sonic landscape, like just this nice field of noise that's very constant. For Miro, a lot of times his paintings evoke this for me, but of course visually you get this like really beautiful diaphanous sort of fields, floods of color, and this one of course is predominantly green, and so it's just this really lovely sort of lavish field of color with these very calligraphic shapes. Miro is often talked about as his line is very calligraphic, like calligraphy, when people write calligraphy. And Breton saw Miro's work, which is largely abstract, and he said, wow, Miro is like giving us dreams through these quasi non-objective paintings. For Breton, he took these paintings as a part of his theories and put them under the rubric of the Freudian dream work. And, I don't think you need, for Miro, I don't think you need that to really appreciate the painting, to find it beautiful. But in some sense, it does make sense. You do get this kind of dreamscape quality to the work, however abstract it might be. And you don't really have a sense of time or scale here, right? So that's also dreamlike usually. It's like a less rational space, and this is a more irrational or ambiguous space of dreams. It could be incredibly small. This could be almost like bacterial or cellular. Like this is just like a cell. What is that process when cells divide? Osmosis, is that what it's called? Biology, very, very long ago. Of course, this is like the reference to the kiss. It's these two shapes that are like meeting here. This might be like the mitochondria of the cell wall, right? So it could be this microscopic view on life, or it could be massive. It could be like more cosmic, right? So there's a real ambiguity at the level of scale, which is this floating sort of dream world, right? So it makes sense that Breton would have taken Miro as part of the original surrealist. You're going to see in the next class, Miro will revolt from Breton, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. So Miro represents this sort of more abstract form of biomorphic form of surrealist painting, but surrealism was not a unified style by any means. There are all sorts of different types of styles, which actually for art historians was very hard to sort of grasp, because most of the time people study things and they want to place it all under one umbrella. But you also had surrealists that would paint very literally, almost in some ways traditionally, through figuration. And one artist is Kirikou, who wasn't a surrealist. He couldn't have been, because he was before the movement. He's an Italian painter, but he's one of these painters that Breton will look to and retroactively nominate a surrealist, which is really convenient, right? But he looked at Kirikou's work and he saw that, oh, here's an artist who's already in some ways tapping into the logic of the dream, but not in a biomorphic abstract way, but in a literal one, right? Where you're actually thrown into a dreamscape. And so this is a very famous one, the child's brain. So you have this man whose eyes are closed. So there's this wonderful kind of ambiguity here, because you think, okay, is he sleeping and dreaming? And if so, is it possible that we're actually seeing him and seeing his dream at the same time? Because the space and the organization of this painting is very ambiguous. You have this column in the front, you have this strange perspective in the back. It's almost like if you're walking down a street in your dream, or if you're anywhere in a dream that looks like a place you've been, but then things are off, things are missing, things are warped and weird. So Breton looked at Kirikou and said, well, here is avant la lettre, before the letter, before the movement itself, someone that's already surrealist. He'll do this with Picasso too. Picasso will become in some ways an honorary surrealist. He'll have his own surrealist phase, especially in the 1930s. And so you have more literal forms of dream painting in the surrealist. Another one who definitely was a surrealist, this is from 1924, the beginnings of surrealism, is Max Ernst. And this is an especially wonderful painting that it's almost like an object lesson in Freud and in the dream work. So you have this painting, it's smaller than you think. This is at MoMA. So when you see it in person, it's actually much smaller than you think. So you have this dreamscape with these very strange figures, this really weird perspective. This house kind of bends backwards, and then you have, very incongruently, the Arc de Triomphe from Paris, and then what looks to be the Taj Mahal, all the way in the background from India. Then you have these two children that for some reason, the one's here, the one's here, and for some reason they're being menaced, they're being chased and threatened by a nightingale. And then a man holding one of the children. it looks like he's about to step outside the painting and push this button. This is a nice literalization of the ways in which the dream can in some ways interact with reality. If we're thinking that the button and the house and this gate, which is thrown wide open, as if like the unconscious and the dream is giving us access, access in real life, in real time, it's as if he's like about to cross the threshold, or at least ring the bell of reality, right? To wake up the whole scene. And this would then be Ernst himself, like having this dream. And you have this strange creature that's lying on the grass. So again, if Ernst is looking to Freud, he would understand and say that this has nothing to do with children, has nothing to do with a mean nightingale. The logic of the dream is much more bizarre and veiled and metaphoric and poetic. So yeah, this is another example of a very literal, surreal but still naturalistic conception of painting. As is probably now the most famous painter of the surrealists, which would be Dali, Salvador Dali, who's also originally Spanish. There's quite a correspondence between Spain and France at this time, and so this is such a famous image. It's very clear how it's dreamlike. So you have this weird blobfish kind of thing. I was looking, that's like a deep sea creature that's now on land. You have these watches that are melting for some reason that's unknown to us. Again, it would mean something. If this was actually a dream. You have a pocket watch with ants flooding out of it. He was obsessed with ants coming out of things. You're going to see that again today. And then this landscape, which doesn't really have any spatial coherence. So this is why I didn't mention this, but I expect extra points for whoever knew where that GIF came from when I was trying to explain the dream work to you. It comes from Inception, a Christopher Nolan movie that maybe you've seen, which has a lot to do with the way dreams work, or it tries to thematize the way dreams work. And one of the things it does that's interesting is that the space inside the dreams is something that you can play with. It moves, it bends. So you don't have this normal everyday conception of the world. It's strange, and it moves, and perspective changes and shifts and so on and so forth. So the back, you notice how this looks like, it's way off in the distance, these sort of cliffs that are going into this water. But is it water? Because it looks like it's also sky. And then when you go to the left part of the painting, this looks like what, 20 feet maybe, right? So spatially, it doesn't make any sense, right? So that's another telltale sign that Dali is working within a dream logic in many of his paintings. And so we'll finish with a couple other concepts that come out of Freud, because it wasn't just the dream that the surrealists were interested in. I'm going to give you at least two other concepts that are important. So here is our man Breton, the head of the surrealists, looking out at you rather intensely. And there's one word that he liked using almost above all others, and this is the marvelous. So for surrealism, his conception of surrealism is that it can make the world marvelous again. And what does he mean by this? He also defines marvelous as objective chance. And this might be one of the more confusing passages in your book, so I wanted to make sure to address this part. The marvelous, or objective chance, for Breton, is an idea that the world itself is not this cold, material, unthinking place, but it actually speaks to you. It's actually full of signs. It's like a forest of signs for Breton. And he gives an example of this. His most famous example, because he also wrote novels. There's an example from Mad Love, where he goes to a flea market and he buys this spoon thing. He doesn't even like it. He doesn't even know why he buys it. And then he brings it home and he puts it in his apartment and he doesn't think about it. Until a little later, where he realizes, wait a second. For the longest time now, well before that visit to the flea market, there was a phrase that kept obsessing him. It was, in French, it's very nice. The translation isn't quite as nice, but in French it's Cendrillon, Cendrier, which is alliterative, right? These kind of Cendrillon, Cendrier, like they're two words that almost like echo each other in some ways. And if you translate it into English, it's Cinderella and ashtray, which of course is no longer as poetic. It doesn't alliterate anymore, Cinderella, ashtray. But it's this nonsensical phrase that was obsessing him. And he even tried to enlist Giacometti, a sculptor, to make a work that would be this Cinderella ashtray, right? He started seeing this spoon as not a spoon, but as a slipper and as an ashtray. And he realized, wait a second, this is the world giving me the thing that I wanted before I even knew that I wanted it or it was there. It was like the world was speaking to him. This object just came out of the real, came out of the objective world. But for him, objective chance and the marvelous would be this incredible meeting point between his own mind and the world. It's almost like an animist conception of the world. It's almost like megalomaniac, right? Where you have an idea, you have a thought, and then it's as if the world meets you halfway, or you even elicited the world to give you what you wanted. And we've probably all had moments like this. I don't know if you've ever seen, like the classic example is if you see, all of a sudden, like for some reason, you start seeing the same number over and over and over again. For Breton, he would say, you got to pay attention to that. It's not just coincidence. There's no way. The world is giving you a sign. It's speaking to you in some ways, right? So if you see these numbers over and over again, you start thinking, oh, maybe I should play them in the lottery. Or other strange coincidences that make you stop and think, oh, maybe this is not a coincidence. Maybe this means something, right? I remember one day when I was still a doctoral student, I was teaching at Brooklyn College, and I was on the train back to my apartment after teaching, and I was reading a book and listening to music. And it was the most uncanny moment where I had read a word on the page, and at that very moment, the singer in the song I was listening to said that same phrase, said that exact same word. So it was like creepy, it was uncanny, and I thought, wait, this must mean something, right? It can't just be pure coincidence. If you're a surrealist, you don't believe in pure coincidence. You believe in the world as this surreal, enchanted place that's giving you messages, that's communicating with you, and in some ways, like your mind is eliciting things. So that's another example. And this actually gets to our last concept for the first half of class. I said that this moment between my book and the song I was listening to was uncanny, because there were two things that happened at the same time. It's this form of repetition, and that's exactly what the uncanny is. This can be talked about as the uncanny. It's uncanny in the sense that it looks like the thing he was after, but didn't know it. But it's also uncanny in experience in the sense that it's a doubling of the shoe. So he started to see this as one shoe, a slipper, and then there's another shoe at the end of it, right? So there's this uncanny doubling, which gets us to this concept from Freud, which is the uncanny. Freud really tried to understand and try to figure out why we find certain things uncanny. And it's not only these coincidences that we find uncanny. Like you see the number 7, like 10 times in one day. That's uncanny. Like why? What's with this repetition of this number? Why am I seeing it everywhere? It's not only that. There are other things that can be very uncanny. So clowns are kind of uncanny. So are dolls. My father retired in France, and when I would go visit him, it was in a kind of a small village in the middle of France, and there was a woman. She was very nice. She was friends with my father, and she had a collection of very old French dolls, and we're talking like basically the whole second floor of her house, and you couldn't see anything other than dolls. And if I would stand in that room and she would be showing me the dolls, I very patiently say, "Oh, how interesting," But it's also very creepy, all these dolls. And for Freud, like zombies, like all sorts of different examples that we could talk about, it's a thing that is almost two things at once. It looks like an object that could come alive. That's the uncanny for Freud. This is why, like, a mannequin or a ventriloquist dummy has this uncanny vibe to it. It's familiar. It looks like, you know, a kid or a human being, but it's unfamiliar at the same time because, of course, it's made of wood. It's not really alive, right? So for Freud, he said this is very disconcerting, and he has a really elaborate theory as to why the uncanny gives us this feeling. I'll just give you two parts of it very quickly. One, he thinks that we have this primordial understanding of the world going back, you know, to prehistoric moments where human beings didn't yet know that a stone was just a stone, a tree was just a tree, and the world was just, you know, like a place filled, you know, made of atoms and elemental material and so on and so forth. There was a conception of the world as magical, as alive. It's like animist in some ways. And so the world can be threatening, right? Lightning is not just lightning. It's not just cloud and electricity. Lightning is some sort of spirit that can threaten you, right? The world is alive. So he thinks that these uncanny moments come from this very deep reservoir in us where we still kind of think in this very prehistoric way that somehow the world can threaten us, can come alive and threaten us. This being Freud, he also has theories that are based in when you're a baby. So when you're a baby, it's kind of well known that you don't really differentiate yourself from the world right off the bat. You don't even see as well as you hear or smell or feel when you're a baby. So you think your mother is basically like an extension of you. You think like your room and your toys or whatever it might be, it's just like it's you, right? So it's not threatening at all. If it's you, and you have total control over it. But then what happens when you get a little older? You start seeing the world, and then you realize, oh my mother is actually an individual. She's not just there to feed me and to make sure I'm happy. My toys are not part of me. They're actual objects out in the world, right? Then this is a moment of anxiety for the child, at least Freud says, because he realizes, wait a second, my mother can leave me. My mother can do other things than simply please me, and my toys could hurt me, right? And so for Freud, he says we still in adulthood have this idea that the world can in some ways hurt us. It's not something we just lose, and for him that's the explanation of the uncanny. And so surrealist artists use this to great effect. This is Hans Bellmer, probably one of the most problematic today, I think we would say, artists of the surrealists. He did a long career. Basically, he lived at home, and he built himself a doll, like of a young woman, basically, and he would pose her in various poses and take photographs. And this was his work. His photograph was mainly sculptural, and also an interplay between photograph, sculpture, and photography. And so this is an example called the Mouth from 1937. And this is definitely fits under this category of the uncanny in so many different ways. It is, I don't know about you, but I find it very creepy. And there's this doubling that happens here. There are all sorts of doublings in this. So obviously the doubling of the legs, the mannequin's legs, you have them on one side, and then weirdly enough, you have them on the other, and they're draped over this chair. So there's this weird doubling. There's also the doubling of the legs becoming a mouth, right? That's the name of the work, this mouth. And he's even tinted the mouth with, like, you know, lipstick or that sort of thing. But then the mouth itself doubles as something else. I think it's easy to see that the legs almost converged in the center at this orifice, which then of course can also read as the female, like a female sexual organ, right? Like the vagina. And of course the surrealist would be happy with these associations that go from the uncanny to the erotic to the sexual and so on and so forth, right? So Bellmer is a very clear example of the uncanny as employed as a visual tactic, as is Magritte, but not in this sort of, I mean, for us today this seems kind of like cheap and easy, and not all that interesting. but that's debatable. But Magritte is much more, I would say, conceptual in the way he used uncanniness, and much more literal. So Magritte, he's a Belgian painter. There was a whole group of Belgian surrealists who were in communication with Platon, fellow travelers in Paris. And he has wonderful paintings. If you like this one, go check out his other paintings. His paintings are almost always like visual puzzles, something to kind of try to figure out. And then a lot of times these puzzles they're not going to be resolvable. And so take my word for it, this painting has occupied philosophers for quite some time. Many of the great philosophers of the 20th century have written about this work, and they find it to be very, very profound, even though it seems so simple. It's a large pipe, like a tobacco pipe, but it's so large that it becomes uncanny, right? It's like not the way you normally see a pipe. And then at the bottom, he has this text that he's written, like handwriting, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," which in French, it translates to "this is not a pipe." So you have this weird moment where this is clearly a pipe, right? Why do you have this text underneath it saying that this is not a pipe? That also makes the whole thing kind of uncanny, right? And this strange little puzzle, like why would Magritte write "this is not a pipe" underneath this picture of a pipe? Again, if we had more time and we read some of these essays together of all these people who have written about this painting, then we could get into it and see why there's this really fruitful ambiguity between text and image in this painting. But for this class, let's leave it there. So take your break, and then when you're ready to get back, we'll go to the second part of surrealism.